And we are live! Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Mishnah Mastery! Hey, with our live, there we go, with our live virtual studio audience. And tonight, guys, really exciting, we are going to try and plow through three chapters of Mishnah. We're going to go through and finish Maseches Temurah and cover, hopefully, chapters 5, 6, and 7. Who's excited? All right, that's a lot of nods and a lot of unmuted microphones. So here we go. Without further ado, let's crack on, first of all, with chapter 5. And chapter 5 is going to be talking about many different things. But what it's going to be starting to talk about is that you can't turn one korban into another, essentially. That's the starting point for us to understand what we're talking about. So a korban bechor, a firstborn animal, is going to have intrinsic kedusha, right? Once it's born, it is holy. It is a firstborn offering, and it needs to be dealt with appropriately, right? And once it's born, you can't designate it as a different korban. But the question that we're going to be asking is, what about while it is inside of the mother? Could you invalidate it as a bechor while it's inside the womb and give it another name? So the question the Mishnah asks is, Ketzad ma'arimim al habechor? How can we go about and trick the system, essentially? As it says on the screen, employ artifice. And in so doing, remove its status as a firstborn animal, which would be needing to be given to a kohen, right? So how can we go about doing this? So the Mishnah says, mevakeres shahaisa meuberes. If you've got a first-time mother animal, which is going to be giving birth to a firstborn offspring, omer, then the person can say, ma shebeme'eha shel zoh, that which is inside the stomach of this animal, im zahar ola. If the animal that she gives birth to is a male, it should be designated as an ola, right? So at this point, he doesn't know if it's going to be male or female, but he says that if it's a male, he wants it to be a korban ola, which is a higher level than a bechor. And then he says, Yalda Zachar Yikrav Ola. So if this mother now gives birth to a male offspring, then it should be given as a korban ola. V'im nekeva, and if he says, and if it's a female animal, zivchei shlamim, then I want to designate it as a korban shlamim. Then the Mishnah says, Yalda nekeva, if the mother goes on and gives birth to a female offspring, tikrav shlamim, then it can be brought as a korban shlamim. Says the Mishnah, im zachar ola, if he says, if it's a male, I want it to be a korban ola. Im nekeva zivchei shlamim, if it's a female, I want it to be a korban shlamim. And then what happens is, yalda zachar and nekeva, it gives birth to two animals. It gives birth to a male and a female. Says the Mishnah, hazachar yikrav ola v'hanekeva tikrav shlamim. Then the male can be brought as a korban ola, and the female can be brought as a korban shlamim. So we take it at face value, even though he was only anticipating that it would give birth to one animal, it still gets processed and gets redesignated into these new types of korbanos, even though it should have been as a bechor when it came out. Mishnah base. Yalda shnei zacharim. What if it gives birth to two males, and you've said one of them, or anticipating one offspring, you said that it should be a korban ola. So the Mishnah says, echad mehen yikrav ola. One of them should be brought as a korban ola. V'hasheni yimachel chayav ola v'damav chulim. And the second one should be sold to somebody who needs to bring a korban ola. And in that way, it can still be brought as a korban ola. It just won't be brought by him. V'damav chulim. And the money that he makes from that transaction is just normal money, and he can use it for anything that he wants. Yalda shtei nekevos, if the animal gives birth to two female offspring, then Achas mehen tikrav shlamim. One of them can be brought as a korban shlamim because that was what he had designated when it was in the womb. V'hashniya tzimach lechayev shlamim. And then the second one could be sold to someone who needs to bring the korban shlamim. V'dameh hachlin. The money that he makes from the transaction would not have any holiness, would not have any temple affiliation. What about though, says the Mishnah, Yalda tumtum v'androgonus? What if the offspring has no genitalia and it's impossible to tell then whether it's male or female? Or what if it presents with both types of genitalia? What then? So Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, Ein kedusha chala aleihem. He says that it will have no sanctity upon it because it won't have gone either way. It won't have been infused with the new designation as a male, and it won't have been infused with the new designation of a female, and so it will presumably then have no sanctity at all, and can just be processed as per norm. Mishnah Gimel. Mishnah Gimel is hinged upon the fact that generally when you consecrate a fetus, if you were to say that the offspring of a particular animal is going to be infused with a particular sanctity, that shouldn't impact the mother, right? You can designate a fetus without having an impact on the mother. But if you consecrate the mother, then the child, the offspring of that animal, is going to assume the same status, the same consecration level. And by further way of introduction, if you sanctify the child to a different status to the mother, and then you consecrate the mother, that can work. So the Mishnah says, Ha'omer, one who says, Vlada shel za'ola v'hi shlamim, if someone says that the offspring of this animal should be a korban ola, and the mother animal should be a korban shlamim, then the Mishnah says, Devar of kayamim. You can do this. This works. He shlamim uvlada ola. If you say that the mother is now a korban shlamim, and the offspring should be a korban ola, which is a higher level, so Rabbi Meir says, Harizov vlad shlamim. Divrei Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir says, we listen to each part of the statement separately. And so as soon as you've pronounced Kedusha on the mother and you've consecrated it as a korban shlamim, that's going to carry through to the child. So even if you say that the offspring should be a korban ola, Rabbi Meir says that it's going to still take the status of a korban shlamim. Amar Rabbi Yossi says, Im lechei niskavein mitchila, if you had intended at the time of your decision, if you knew what you wanted, then hoil v'i efshar likro shnei shtemas ke'echas devar kayamim. So since it's impossible to designate two things in one go, therefore his words can be fulfilled. So it's not going to be possible to articulate in one fell swoop that the mother can be a shlamim and the child can be a korban ola. And he might not have realized that by labeling the mother with one designation that it would have a knock-on effect to the child. So therefore, says Rabbi Yossi, yeah, you can designate the mother and still designate the offspring with a different designation because you might not have realized otherwise. So that's Rabbi Yossi. Then the Mishnah says, "V'im misha amar harei zo shlamim nimlach v'amar v'lada ola harei zo vlad shlamim." However, if he had intended to designate it as a korban shlamim, but then as he designates it, he then changes his mind and realizes, oh, wait, the offspring should be an ola. So in that instance, since it had been your original mindset to give them the same designation, so therefore the offspring is going to be a shlamim as well. Mishnah Dalet. Mishnah Dalet. Harei zot temuras ola utemuras shlamim. If a person was to say that let's map out the situation here. You've got a korban ola and you've got a korban shlamim. Yeah, you've got two animals in front of you, and you want to take a third profane animal, and you want to do Temurah onto it. You want to substitute it. But what you do is you kind of say it's going to be a half ola and a half shlamim. You want it to be functioning as a substitute for both. So Mishnah says, Harezot Temuras ola utmuras shlamim. A person says this third animal should be a substitute, and it should be a korban ola and a korban shlamim. Harezot Temuras ola, divrei Rabbi Meir. So Rabbi Meir says you go by the first one. The first one he said was ola, and therefore it's going to have the status of an ola. Amar Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi says, Im lechein niskaven mitchila. If it was his intention that it should be half-half, hoil v'iyevshar likro shnei shemes ka'echas devarav kayamim. Since it's not possible to make two designations at the same time, simultaneously, therefore his words should stand. And if after he says that it should be a Temuras Ola, a substitute for a Korban Ola, Nimlach va'amar Temuras Shlamim, he then changes his mind, says it should be a Temurah for a Shlamim, then Harei Zot Temuras Ola. Then everyone would agree, even Rabbi Yossi would agree, that it should have the status of an Ola. And if you, I have nothing further to add on that, I don't think. Mishnah Hey. Hare zo tachas zo. So we're discussing expressions. Which expressions are going to be effective wording to activate Temurah? All right, what does he have to say? So Hare zo tachas zo. If he says this profane animal should be in place of that holy animal, or he says Temuras zo, it should be the substitute for that animal. Chalifas zo, or it should be exchanged for that animal. Harei zo Temurah. That's all effective wording to be able to designate it as Temurah, which would mean that it is sanctified, and then you're in trouble because you're not supposed to have done Temurah. Zot mechuleles al zo. But if a person says this animal should be redeemed on that animal, Eino Temurah, that does not qualify it as Temurah, does not qualify it as a substitution, because redemption is not the same as Temurah, so nothing happens. Ve'im haya hekdesh balmum, and if it was an animal which was hekdesh, and it was consecrated to the Beis HaMikdash, but it was blemished, yotzei lechulin v'tzarech la'asos damim, then so if you were trying to what's going on here? You're trying to substitute a profane animal for a consecrated animal which is blemished. Is that right? Is that what we're trying to do? And if the consecrated animal was blemished, yeah. So then Yotzei L'chulin. So then it would be downgraded and have its sanctity taken away. V'tzarich la'asos damim. And then what would happen is that they have to do an appraisal of the value of these two animals. And if the consecrated animal was worth more than the profane animal, then he is going to have to pay the difference to the Beis HaMikdash for the difference in the two values of the two animals. But what does that mean? That means that you have transferred the sanctity over if it was a blemished animal. And then finally, as we are all massively on board with everything we've heard so far, to finish off chapter 5 of Maseches Temurah, you have to have a specific animal that you're doing Temurah with. So the Mishnah says, Harei zo tachas chatas. This animal, this profane animal, should be in place of a korban chatas, or the tachas ola, or it should be in place of a korban ola, lo amar klum. Then he has not said anything. But tachas chatas zo. But if he designates a specific korban chatas that it should be substituted for, the tachas ola zo, or should be in place of this specific korban ola, tachas chatas v'tachas ola sheyesh li b'toch habayis, where he says, for a specific animal that I have in my house, hayalo, and if he has that animal at home, devarav kayamim, then his words are going to be effective, and Temurah will be activated, which is going to be a problem. Im amar al behema tameya, if he says that he wants to exchange it for a behemoth tameah, that they should be a non-kosher animal should be designated balas mum, or a blemished animal should be designated as a hare elu ola. So he says that these non-kosher animals or these blemished animals should be a korban ola lo amarklam. Then it's not going to be an effective designation. Hare elu la ola. If he was to say that these animals should be as a korban ola, then yimachru v'yavi b'dmehem ola. So then we have an interesting situation, because these non-kosher animals, one second. Sorry, if he said about a non-kosher animal or a blemished animal, hare elu ola, so what he's saying is these things can't be brought as an ola, and therefore it's not effective. But hare elu la ola, but if he says that these animals should be a korban ola, so it doesn't necessarily mean that they themselves have to be brought as a korban ola. He's just saying that these animals have to generate a korban ola. Then yimachru v'yavi b'dmehem ola. Then you can sell those animals, and the proceeds of the sale would then have to be used to buy a korban ola, because by designating hare elu la'ola, that these things should go towards a korban ola, rather than saying these animals should be a korban ola. What you're saying is that even the proceeds of a sale would be put towards a korban ola, and that's therefore what the person would have to do. Mazel tov, everybody, on completing chapter 5. Let's dive in with chapter 6. Here we go. Anything which is forbidden to be brought on the Mizbeach. Am I doing okay? Because my internet is telling me that it's got a problem. We are okay? Everyone can see me, everyone can hear me. Excellent. So any animal which is forbidden to be on the Mizbeach, Osrin Kol Shehen, if they were to get mixed up with other animals, all of those animals would now be forbidden. There's no way of rectifying the situation. We're familiar that in other instances, if things get mixed in, then we might say, oh yeah, well, if it's 1 in 60 or if it's 1 in 100, then you can still proceed. The Mishnah is saying anything which is prohibited from being brought up onto the Mizbeach, if it gets mixed in with other animals and you can't distinguish what is what, then all of those animals are going to be forbidden. What are we talking about? So the Mishnah says, Haroveya. If an animal had violated a person, Vahanirba, or a person had violated through bestiality an animal, Vahamukta, if an animal had been designated for idol worship, set aside for idol worship, or for service of idol worship, Vahanevad, or an animal had been set aside and worshipped for avodah zarah, ve'esnan, if an animal was used as payment for a prostitute, umechir, or it was set aside as payment for a dog. We're going to explain a lot of these terms soon. Vahakil ayin, or if it was the product of two different species being mated to produce an offspring. Vahatrefa, or it had a fatal wound which was not able to be distinguished, and therefore it could still pass the test as a korban, but it's actually been susceptible to a fatal injury. V'yotze dofen, or an animal which has been born by caesarean section. So in all of these instances, they are forbidden to be brought on the Mizbeach, and if they were to get mixed up with healthy animals, you wouldn't be able to bring any of those animals for a korban. Asks the Mishnah, Ezahu muktzah. What do we mean when we say that an animal is muktzah, that it is set aside? Says the Mishnah, ha-muktzah la'avodah zarah. It was set aside for idol worship. Hu asur, that animal would be forbidden. Umashalav mutar, but anything that it was adorned with would be permitted for use. It doesn't have the status of something that was worshipped or used in service of avodah zarah. because if it did, then everything would be prohibited, which is why the Mishnah says, Ezehu ne'evad. What do we mean when we say it was used in service of Avodah Zarah? Kol she'ovdin osa, anything that was used, anything that was worshipped. Who umasha alav asar, and in such an instance, the animal and anything that it was on it, any clothing or fabrics or decorations or ornaments or adornments, they would all be forbidden. However, says the Mishnah, in the case of muktzah and ne'evad, either of those types of animals would be permitted for eating. They wouldn't be fundamentally not kosher, so to speak. Asks the Mishnah in Mishnah base, Ezehu etnan. What do we mean when we say etnan? What does that mean? Ha'omer lazona, a person who says to a prostitute, Hey lich tale ze bischarech, take this lamb as your payment. Afilu me'ah, even if he was to give her 100 lambs, so even though she charges him 1 lamb, but he pays with 100 lambs, then kulan asur, they are all going to be forbidden. V'chein ha'omer lechaveron, similarly, someone who says to his friend, Hey lecha tala zeh v'talin shifchasacha etzel avdi, take this lamb and in return your maidservant will lie with my slave. So that, the Mishnah says, would also be an etnan. You wouldn't be allowed to do that. Rabbi Omer, not etnan. Rabbi Meir says that is not payment to a prostitute. Meaning, the first case he would agree is the second case of buying off your maidservant for your slave. That would not be the halachic equivalent of paying for a prostitute, and therefore that would not make that animal qualified as an esnan. The chachamim omrim esnan, but the chachamim say no, it actually would, and it's a problem. You're not allowed to do it. Mishnah Gimel, Ezahu mechir kelev. What did the Mishnah mean when it gave as one of the examples a mechir kelev, used as a price of a dog? Ha'omer lechaver, one who says to his friend, Hey lecha tala zeh tachas kelev zeh. This taleh, this lamb, should be in place of the dog, meaning this is a fair trade. V'chein shnei shutafin shecholku. Similarly, 2 partners who were dividing up 19 lambs and 1 dog, and the way that they were doing it was to say echad nata asara, that one of them should take 10 lambs, the echad nata tisha v'chelev, and the other should take 9 lambs and 1 dog, meaning that the dog is of equal value to these lambs. So the Mishnah says shekeneged hakelev asurim. All of the lambs that the partner took along with the kelev, all of those now are forbidden for use on the mizbeach, because they have all been subject to an assessment of making them the same price as a dog. That says the Mishnah, she'ima kelev mutarim. I think I've got that wrong. I think the 10 lambs, which are of equal value to the dog, are going to be forbidden. The sha'im hakelev, and the 9 that came along with the dog, those are still going to be permitted. Etnan kelev umechir zona. What if you used one as a payment for having intimate relations with a dog, umechir zona, and one as equal value, the price to pay for a zona? So then the Mishnah says, Hare elu mutarim. Then these animals are still going to be permitted. Shnei mar, because the verse says shnayim. It talks about 2 animals, 2 categories. 2 are categories which are prohibited. 1, payment to a prostitute, and 2, the price of a dog. So those are the only biblical qualifications for those 2 categories. V'lo arba, and it didn't then indicate the additional 2 cases of payment for intercourse with a dog and the price of a prostitute. And therefore, those animals would still be permitted if that's what you did with them. Don't recommend it, but there you go. Valdo sehem mutarim. The offspring of any of these animals is still going to be permitted. Shnei mar, as the verse says, hein. It refers to those specific animals. Velo valdo sehem. And it doesn't refer to the offspring of these 2 categories of etnan and mechir kelev. Mishnah Daled. Mishnah Dalet. Nasan la ksafim hare elu mutarim. If a person gave money to a prostitute as payment, then hare elu mutarim. That money is nonetheless still permitted to be used for the purchasing of other things. Yea not, but if you used wine to pay her, or shmanim, or oil, or slatos, or flour, or anything that could in theory be consecrated for use in the Beis Hamikdash, asur, that all of those things are going to be forbidden to be used in the Beis Hamikdash. Nosam la mukdashin hare elu mutarim. If you were to give her things which had been consecrated to the temple as payment for her services, then those things are still going to be permitted to the Beis Hamikdash. Is that right? Is that what I've just said? If he gave her consecrated items, their sacrifice is permitted because they were already consecrated. They do not belong to him. And so he cannot prohibit or cause an item to be prohibited which did not belong to him. That's what the Mishnah is telling us. Fascinating. Ofot, if he gave her birds, hare elu asurin, then these birds are going to be forbidden for use in the Beis Hamikdash. Even if they were not sacred when he paid her, they are not going to be allowed to be sacrificed. And the Mishnah says, Shahaya Badin. This is logical. Why? Ma'im hamukdashim, shahamum posel bahem. Just like with consecrated items which are infused with sanctity for the Beis Hamikdash, where a blemish would invalidate them, ein esnan umechir chal aleihem. They would not be subject to penalization if someone used them as an etnan payment or a mechir kelev payment, because you can't do that with something that doesn't belong to you. So the logic the Mishnah employs is ophos she'ein hamum posel bahen, a bird which won't be invalidated through a mum, through a blemish. Eino badin shelo yehe etnan umechir chal aleihen. Is it not logical to say that these birds should therefore not be subject as well to being classified as an etnan or a mechir kelev? And therefore, logic should dictate to us that they should be allowed to be brought on the mizbeach if they were used as payment for a prostitute or for a price of a dog. Talmud Loma comes along the verse to say l'chol neder. When the verse says l'chol neder, what that does is it tells us lahavi es ha'of, that it should include a bird in the prohibition, meaning that if you then use a bird as payment or as a mechir kelev, then they are also going to be forbidden for use in the Beis Hamikdash, and they don't therefore have the same leniency as what we saw before with consecrated items. Very easy to understand. Mishnah, hey. All of the 9 things that we saw in the first Mishnah, all of those different categories, even though they are forbidden to be brought on the Mizbeach, their offspring are permitted. Says the Mishnah, Kol ha'asurim al gabei Mizbeach, all of those 9 categories that we saw in the first Mishnah, they are forbidden to be brought on the Mizbeach, but their offspring are permitted. Vlad treifa, however, with regards to the offspring of a treifa animal, an animal which is suffering from a fatal wound, that is the exception to the rule. Rabbi Eliezer says, Lo yikrav al gabei mizbeach. You're not allowed to bring the offspring of a treifa on the mizbeach. V'chachamim arim yikrav, but the chachamim say, no, actually, yes, you can. So it's a machlokes. Rabbi Chanina ben Antigna says, Kashera sheyanka min a treifa. If a kosher animal was nursing from a treifa, pasula me'al gabei mizbeach, then that animal would be forbidden to be brought on the Mizbeach. So the Chachamim say that a treifa mother is not going to invalidate the offspring. Rabbi Eliezer says it is going to be invalid. Rabbi Chanina ben Antigna says, agreeing fundamentally with Rabbi Eliezer, that the offspring can't be brought as a korban. Says the Mishnah, Kol hakotshim shenasu treifa, any sacrifice which becomes treifa, which becomes an animal which was suffering from a fatal wound, ein podinosam, they cannot be redeemed. Because you can't eat it. So you can only redeem it if it would be capable of being redeemed. Now, if you were to redeem a korban, it could also be fed to the dogs. But what this final clause in the Mishnah is telling us is that if it can't be eaten by people, but it could still be eaten by a dog, then it can't be redeemed. So, ein podinosam, you can't redeem an animal which is a treifa. She'ein podim es hakochim laha'achilan laklavim. You can't redeem an animal for the sole purpose of being able to feed it to the dogs. It has to somewhat be fundamentally capable of being permitted to humans as well for consumption. But even then, in that instance, you would have the right, if you wanted to feed it to the dogs. But if it could only be fed to the dogs, then the Mishnah says, to finish off chapter 6, that it cannot be redeemed. Mazel tov, everybody. I'm completing chapter 6. Let's move into our final chapter for this evening, and let's finish Maseches Temurah together. So for Perek Zayin, for chapter 7, for Mishnah Aleph, we are going to be contrasting halachot of animals which have been consecrated for korbanos with animals that are sanctified for the Beis Hamikdash, for temple coffers. So we're going to see 8 halachot to start with. Yesh b'kodshe mizbeach masha'ein b'kodshe berek habayis. There are 8 halachas that apply to the sacrifices for the mizbeach that don't apply to animals which get sanctified for use in the Beis Hamikdash. V'yesh b'kodshe berek habayis masha'ein b'kodshe mizbeach. And we're going to see, I think, 4 halachas, 4 stringencies that apply to an animal that gets designated for the Beis Hamikdash, which don't apply for an animal which gets designated explicitly as a sacrifice. Shekadshe mizbeach osin temurah. Number 1, when you designate an animal for the korbanos, it could be subject to temurah. It could be subject to being substituted. That's number 1. That's not the case for an animal that gets designated for the Beis Hamikdash. Number 2, v'chayavin aleihem mishum pigel. It could be subject to pigel. If a person was to do one of the 4 main processes of a sacrifice, if you remember, we talked all the way back at the beginning in Zvachim. If you slaughter it with the wrong intention, if you collect the blood, if you transport the blood, or if you sprinkle the blood with the wrong intention, you could make it pigel. But that's only if it's an animal that has been designated specifically for a sacrifice, as opposed to an animal which just gets designated for use in the Beis Hamikdash. So it could be, a person could be liable for pigel, a person could be liable for nosar. If the meat gets left over beyond its eating time, it will qualify as nosar, which is a problem. V'tamei, and if you were to be impure and eat this korban, then you are going to be in trouble, which wouldn't be the case for something that was designated for the Beis Hamikdash. 5 and 6, v'ladan v'chalavan asur la'acha pidyonim. Their offspring and their milk would be forbidden for consumption even after they were redeemed. So if a korban developed a blemish, you could eat and you can sell the meat after redemption, but the offspring and the milk are still going to be problematic. Number 7, v'hashechatam b'chutz chayav. A person who slaughters them outside of the confines of the Beis Hamikdash is going to be chayav kares. V'ein nosnin mehem la'umanim b'scharam. And you can't give them to craftsmen as payment. Is that even after they get redeemed, or is that not sure? Masha'ein kain b'kodshe berek habayis. That's not the case with animals which get consecrated to the Beis Hamikdash. Mishnah base, 4 stringencies the other way around. Yesh b'kodshe berek habayis, masha'ein b'kodshe mizbeach. There are 4 things, 4 stringencies that apply to an animal designated for the Beis Hamikdash that don't apply to an animal designated as a sacrifice. Shestam hekdeshos leberek habayis. If a person made an unspecified or unspecific consecration, then it will immediately be linked as a animal for use in the Beis Hamikdash. Hekdesh bedek habayis chal al hakol. What does that mean? Yeah, that's what it means. If a person was to dedicate any item, not just an animal, but any item could be designated to the Beis Hamikdash, but that's not the case for something that gets designated as a sacrifice. You can't say this pen is going to be a korban ola or this bowl is going to be a korban ola. You can't say that, but you could say that this bowl or this pen or whatever it is going to be for bedek habayis. Not only that, umoalin begidulehen. So for things which get donated to the Beis Hamikdash, they are subject to me'ilah, being potentially misappropriated, misused. But not only that animal could be misused, but anything that comes from that animal could be misused. And that's not the same for a korban. So when you designate something for the Beis Hamikdash, then you consecrate the entirety of that animal. But when you consecrate for a korban, for the mizbeach, even though you can't use their milk or you can't use their eggs, whatever it might be, there is no violation of me'ilah. Whereas there is if it gets designated for upkeep, temple upkeep. And the final thing is v'ein bahem hana lekohanim. There is no permission for the kohanim to receive any benefit. So whereas with korbanos, a kohen will receive various different portions, if an animal gets designated for bedek habayis, for the upkeep of the Beis Hamikdash, the kohen is not entitled to anything. Mishnah Gimel. Similarities between a sacrifice and an animal which gets consecrated for the upkeep of the Beis Hamikdash. Echad kodshei mizbeach ve'echad kodshei bedek habayis. Whether it is a sacrifice, whether it is for the upkeep of the Beis Hamikdash, ein meshanin osan mikdusha likdusha. You cannot change its status. Once it's consecrated for one, it can't be consecrated for the other. Even if a korban gets blemished, it can't become bedek habayis, for example. Umakdishin osan hekdesh ilui umacharimin osam. And you can consecrate an animal once an animal is consecrated as a korban, you can consecrate its value to be donated to the Beis Hamikdash. Umacharimin osam. And what does that mean? Macharimin means that you may consecrate animals already consecrated for the altar by consecrating the value, and one may dedicate them. Okay, what does that mean? One may dedicate them for the purpose of giving their value to the priests. So even after they are sanctified in this way, you could still consecrate and dedicate further. I think that's what it's saying. Says the Mishnah. Where is it? Imesu yikaveru. And if either of these animals, whether something designated as a sacrifice or designated for the upkeep of the Beis Hamikdash, if they die, they must be buried. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Rabbi Shimon says, why must they be buried? Because they can't be redeemed to feed to the dogs. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Rabbi Shimon says, Kodshei bedek habayis imesu yipadu. Rabbi Shimon says differently. He says that if it was designated for upkeep in the Beis Hamikdash and then it died, then you would be allowed to redeem it and you would be allowed to then feed them onto the dogs. But that's not the case for sacrifices. Mishnah Daled. For the rest of the Perek, and therefore for the rest of the Masechta, we are going to deal with two consequences if you can't use or eat something. You're either going to have to bury it or you're going to have to burn it. So we're going to bring a series of halachot where the halacha would be that you have to bury them first. What's the difference between burning and burying? Well, the difference is that once you burn them up, the ashes could still be problematic. So if you burn something that needed to be buried, then the ashes are going to be problematic. You can't use the ashes. They're still going to be forbidden, and therefore you have to bury it. But something which you can burn, something which the halacha is you can burn, then the ashes would still be permitted. So says the Mishnah, Ve'eluhein hanikbarim. These are things which would have to be buried rather than burnt. Kodshim shepilu. If a sacrifice had a miscarriage, yikaveru, then the miscarriage has to be buried, not burnt. Hipila shilya, if it miscarried a placenta, tikaver, then it should be buried, not burnt, because the ashes would be prohibited if it was burnt up. Shor haniskal, a ox that is subject to the death penalty, subject to being stoned to death on account of having killed a person, ve'egla arufa, and the decapitated heifer, ve'tzipore metzora, and the birds used to purify a metzora, usar nazir, and the hair that gets shaved off a Nazirite who is going through a purification process, upeter chamor, or a firstborn donkey, ubasar b'chalav, and meat which gets mixed up with milk, v'chulin shenishchatu ba'azara, and profane animals which get slaughtered in the Beis Hamikdash. So all of these things you would think they have to be buried. Says Rabbi Shimon, however, Rabbi Shimon Omer, if a profane animal gets slaughtered in the Azara, then you have to burn it, not as a korban, but you have to burn it outside of the Azara. Why? Because you might confuse people otherwise. Because if you go and slaughter a perfectly healthy animal and then you go and bury it, then people are going to think that if you slaughter an actual sacrifice and then that sacrifice ends up being blemished, you might think that the halacha is that you have to go and bury it, but it's not. The halacha is you have to go and burn it. And so that's why Rabbi Shimon would say you have to burn this animal that was slaughtered in the wrong place. And that is the same halacha he would say for an undomesticated animal which got slaughtered in the Azara. That too would have to be burnt, not buried, even though people would not be under any misconception that you can bring an undomesticated animal as a korban. Even so, he would say you have to avoid the confusion. And that's the machlokas, therefore, between the Tanna Kama and Rabbi Shimon. Let's continue with Mishnah Hey. We are flying high, guys. Only a couple of Mishnahs left, and we finish Maseches Temurah. Ve'elu hein hanisrafim. These are animals which would require burning, or these are things which would require burning rather than burying. Chametz b'Pesach. If you find chametz on Pesach, yisaref, it should be burnt up. Utrumat, which is consistent with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda in Maseches Pesachim, chapter 2, where there is a machlokes, but that is what the Mishnah is saying over here. Just in case any of you were thinking, hey, hang on a minute, wasn't that a machlokes in Maseches Pesachim? That's why. Very good, well done. Utruma tameya. If teruma gets contaminated with tuma, v'ha'orla, or you've got fruits within the first 3 years of the tree being planted, the kile hakerem, or you have got what's the word? Kilayim. You've got you've got a forbidden mixture of crops grown in a vineyard. Es shedarko lisaref yisaref. So anything which should be burnt should be burnt. Ve'es shedarko lekaver yikaver. And anything which should be buried should be buried. What does that mean? So dry items should be burnt, and liquid items such as oil or wine that comes from kilei akerem, so you can't burn those up. So those things would have to just get buried. Umadlikin bepat ubashemen shel teruma, and you can light. You can use oil of teruma to be able to light the oven to cook your bread, because fundamentally you're allowed to benefit. You're just not allowed to eat it. So therefore, these things, when they're getting burnt up, they could be used to benefit you in some way. However, these other items, that's only with regards to Terumah. With regards to everything else, they are not allowed to have any benefit, and therefore they wouldn't be allowed to use as fuel for a fire, to be able to do things like baking your bread. And finally, as if it wasn't clear enough, Mishnah Vav. Mishnah Vav. Any sacrifice which was slaughtered with the wrong time in your mind, just like we saw right at the very beginning of Maseches Vachim, or with the wrong place designated in your mind, Hare elu yisarefu, then these things have to be burnt up. Asham talui, if you have got an asham talui, which was the guilt offering, which you weren't sure if you had actually committed a sin or not, so that has to be burnt up. 1 second. So what are we talking about? So in the first case, we said that it was slaughtered with the wrong intention. We also forgot to mention any of those four things, any of those four processes would make it need to be burnt up. So if he had the wrong intention at the time of slaughtering, at the time of collecting, at the time of transporting, or at the time of sprinkling, in all of those instances, it has to be burnt up. Asham talui yisaref. If you're bringing this limbo guilt offering and then you actually discover you did or did not sin, so then that asham talui has to be burnt up. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Yikaver. Rabbi Yehuda says it has to be buried. It's only a sacrifice which gets invalidated through your action that you would have to burn up. Whereas this, it's only invalid because, you've actually realized what you did wrong or what you didn't do wrong. A bird sin offering which is being brought in cases of doubt, and then that doubt gets resolved, then tisaref, it has to get burnt up. Rabbi Yehuda Omer yatilenu la'amah. Rabbi Yehuda says you don't burn it up, you have to throw it into the temple courtyard drain, and then let nature take its toll and let nature dissolve it. Anything which needs to be burnt up should not be buried. And anything where the halacha is it has to be buried, it should not be burnt up. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Rabbi Yehuda says, Rabbi Yehuda says there's more effort involved in burning than there is in burying. It's a better form of disposal. So even though we said that there were concerns that the ashes might be used wrongly, nonetheless, Rabbi Yehuda says we don't have to be worried about that. And so if you want to be strict on yourself and burn something which should be buried, I would let you. Amru lo, but the Chachamim say, Einon mutar l'shanos. You're not allowed to change things up. We're afraid that people are going to use the ashes when they're not allowed to, and therefore, if it needs to be buried, make sure you bury it. If it needs to be burnt, make sure you burn it. And we say together, Nishlama Maseches Temurah, Nishlama Maseches Temurah, Nishlama Maseches Temurah. Mazel tov, everybody, on completing Maseches Temurah. And let's see you next time when we move into the exciting world of Maseches Kritos. But for now, Mazel tov. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you all again very soon.